So I really want to thank Johannes for that introduction, and thank Shauna Delansky and Emma Fraser for organizing this talk. I've actually for a long time been quite an admirer of the Carleton MA program in religion and public life. I think it's a great idea, and more religion departments should be thinking along those lines, including my own. We have had a number of your excellent graduates join our programs in our MA, our PhD program especially. And I would be delighted to talk to any MA students about learning more about our PhD program at U of T. Feel free to send me an email. What I want to do this evening is reflect on the question of religion, pandemics, and the body politic through the vantage point of 3 epidemic images. So artistic renderings or photographs made about epidemics or in epidemics or around epidemics. And I'll frame these disparate images, they're quite disparate, with some theoretical reflection about how I think about religion and public life from different levels of approach. And a lot of my reflection comes from a course that I'm co-teaching this semester called Plagues and Peoples, From Divine Intervention to Public Health. It's a new course that I've designed with my colleague Janelle Taylor, who's a medical anthropologist. And it was really exciting to me when I first sent an abstract in to Shauna. It was about a research project that I'm doing. And she's like, no, we want you to talk about your course. And I'm like, that's so exciting to actually get to reflect in this kind of extended way on teaching. So I'm really grateful for the invitation one more time. So teaching a course on plagues in the midst of COVID-19 has been fascinating and sobering. We're thinking together with 90 students about how the stories that we tell about pandemics actually shape the course of contagion, of who gets sick and how we respond collectively to their suffering. Stories, you could say, like viruses, travel from person to person. Stories, however, get amplified by various forms of mediation. I mean, in one way, they go viral. One might argue that Facebook itself is perhaps more of an affordance for the super spreader, or for super spreading ideas about the coronavirus and the virus itself, more so even than an airplane or a bus, if you think in terms of the number of people affected. So contagion narratives about the causation or the etiology of a virus make a difference for how people respond to their effects, the effects of a virus, and how they take up and enact public health measures. The stories we hear about the virus and vaccines make a difference for who wears a mask, who gets vaccinated, who stays home during a lockdown. In our class, we've asked the students to develop skills of visual analysis as well in order to see how images play a part in the stories that we tell about plagues and peoples. And here I have to give a shout out to Christina Pasqua, who is one of my PhD students and a graduate of the Religion and Public Life MA. Johannes was her supervisor, I learned. Who really led the way in helping students learn how to do this kind of visual analysis. And she's much better at it than I am, but it really is a skill. So like everyone, our students are living through COVID-19 and its deadly and deadening effects. And we had hoped that having the time and place for sort of meta reflection on life in a time of pandemic would actually perhaps do something to help the students find their way through this online winter semester. And I do think the course is largely working in that regard, thanks in large part to the amazing TAs, Christina included. But the semester, I would say, is also tough, nonetheless, for everyone, I think for all of us. So with that in mind, for the next 40 minutes or so, I invite you to listen and look and reflect on how stories and images help us to see connections between and among religion, public life, and pandemics. So the COVID-19, maybe Emma, you can start. Yeah, there we go. The COVID-19 pandemic raises profound questions about how public life is structured in the US and Canada, especially, and what role public health plays in the mix. Religion is definitely part of the massive disruption that is COVID-19 in ways that support public health and public life, and in ways that refuse the very idea of public health as a public good. I'm going to talk briefly about both approaches here. So religious groups, largely Christian groups, I'll focus on, who support public health measures and those who oppose public health measures as government intrusion into private life or even satanic conspiracies. But I also want to introduce a third perspective on the question of religion and public health by discussing Indigenous perspectives on how COVID-19 raises questions about treaty obligations in Canada. So Indigenous scholars and health experts have been asking how ongoing structures of colonialism or infrastructures of colonialism shape Indigenous suspicions of public health during the pandemic, especially in context of vaccine hesitancy. They're also developing alternative visions for public health oriented by Indigenous teachings and ceremony. So the pandemic has revealed multiple ways that religion can represent a resource and a risk for the success and the very idea of public health. Public health depends on how and whether people accept scientific authority and value scientific evidence for guidance to live together in community. And the COVID-19 pandemic reminds us of how questions of public confidence in public health is so critical. I don't know how to turn off my text, sorry. So you'll hear them dinging. And of the importance of understanding religion as a social determinant of health that shapes systems and practices of healthcare around the world. So I've gathered just 3 images from different classes over the course of what I've been teaching that I've used in my class to approach these questions. And they come from very different times and places shaped by pandemics and the stories that we tell about them. So this is where my first image comes in, and you can shift the slide, Emma, please. These portraits of Martin Luther and his wife, Katerina, a former monk, former nun, who married in 1525 when Katerina was 26 and Martin was 41. I love these images. They're probably not the best quality, but it's best I could do from the internet. So Martin Luther, as many of you will know, is a leader of the Protestant Reformation, one of them, and was one of those rare people who enabled their own authority through contesting the authority of the dominant powers of the day. Not everyone gets away with that. So obviously he was, contesting the Catholic Church in various ways. These paintings by the legendary Lucas Cranach the Elder were 2 of many similar images, because Cranach made something of a business of painting and selling images of Martin and Katerina Luther. I'm sure it was very exciting to have this monk and nun kind of marry and send their images around. He was also their friend. He was a witness at their wedding. I am not an art historian, nor am I a scholar of the Reformation, but Johannes is, so he can correct us later on if we need correcting. And I will note there are a lot of very interesting books and articles written about these images in particular. But for me, one of the really interesting things about these paintings is that they were painted in 1526 and 1528. In 1527, right in between, Luther wrote a letter to a fellow pastor, which was widely shared in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is how I came to see it. A letter that's titled, "Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague." Some of you may have also read it online. So thinking about these particular images as painted at a time when bubonic plague, or the threat of it, haunted people and villages, brings a different perspective to the strapping reformer and his impossibly small-waisted wife. There's a lot of commentary about her bodily proportions in that painting. Bubonic plague was a terrifying disease. It progressed very rapidly. It was disfiguring. It discolored your skin. It had horrible smells attached to it. It was unpredictable. It would seem to die down and then it would just come roaring back in another wave. It was obviously sometimes very mysterious about who would be affected, who was not, who would die, who would survive. And its symptoms varied. Sometimes there would be these buboes that's where bubonic comes from, these kind of boils on your skin, sometimes pneumonia, sometimes septicemia. It was a terrifying disease. Thinking about these images when reading the newly married or fairly newly married Luther's writings brings a particular urgency and even poignancy to his letter. So I'm going to turn to that for a little bit. Emma, if you can switch to the next slide. So here, it's a pretty long letter, but you can find it online and read the whole thing if you want. But he basically turns to biblical authority and kind of his own. He's being asked by one of his colleagues to comment on what is one's obligation as a Christian when those around you are dying from a deadly plague. Can you escape, or do you need to stick with them? And so he says, what you do or fail to do for your neighbor means doing the same to God. If you wish to serve Christ and to wait on him, very well. You have your sick neighbor close at hand, go to him and serve him. That's how you can serve God, by helping the poor and the sick. He also has some strong thoughts on what the secular authorities, the non-church authorities, and we could have a whole other conversation about the word secular, but I'm not going to go there right now, where he says that all people in public offices, such as mayors, judges, and the like, are under an obligation to remain. They also have that obligation. And it's also an obligation for Luther that comes from God's word, comes from the biblical sort of obligation to care for the sick and the others, and the poor. So it's God institutes a secular authority and commands that town and country be ruled, protected, and preserved, as St. Paul teaches in Romans 13:4. The governing authorities are God's ministers for your own good. And then if you can switch to the next slide, thank you. He also has some pretty clear words about what you might call public health, that there has to be a collective approach to sickness and suffering, and that this is both efficient and sort of ethical, or the Christian thing to do. So instead of making people take care of their loved ones in their home, there should be a collective approach. There should be hospital staff with people to take care of the sick, so that patients from private homes can be sent there. And this is in the Christian tradition of earlier bequests, hospices, hospitals, infirmaries. That would indeed be a fine, commendable, and Christian arrangement to which everyone should offer generous help and contributions, particularly the government. Doesn't matter, federal, provincial, you got to pay up to help for this in service of public health. So Luther was a leader with authoritative knowledge at the intersection of public health and religion in his day. He roots it in biblical passages, Christian concepts of sin and the secular. The fact that his letter was so widely shared, both in its time, but also in social media in the early days of COVID-19, as well as then in my course, shows that his authoritative knowledge has had some staying power. And here the questions of pandemics and public memory becomes really interesting in terms of how we remember past pandemics to understand what we're living through today. So before moving from the Reformation context to contemporary North America, I want to lay out a little bit more about how the idea of authoritative knowledge is a key aspect of how I think with the concept of religion. So in my research, I've thought a lot about how religion and medicine intersect in North America, and I do so by approaching the question at 4 different levels. So the first one, if you can switch the slide, Emma, that'd be great, is the level of the individual person and how their religious convictions and their personal histories shape what choices they make as embodied beings, in this case, in the context of a pandemic and with public health measures. So in the case of COVID-19, staying home, adhering to lockdowns, physical distancing, quarantine, those are individual choices that only work when people think that they make sense and that they actually apply them to their own bodies. So at Easter time, you might remember last year, there was a lot of discussion about whether there was going to be services or not. Donald Trump had something to say about it. I heard on CBC a Pentecostal woman saying that, she'd been covered in Jesus's blood, so it was fine for her to go to church and to Walmart and to anywhere. And for her, public health measures really did not make sense. But for other Christians who find Luther's letter reassuring, an alignment between public health and Christian obligation does make sense. So that's a kind of personal level. Then the second level of religion as a kind of form of authoritative knowledge that people turn to in a crisis, and sometimes in the everyday as well, is sort of the next step. So sometimes authoritative knowledge might be embodied in human figures of authority, medical doctors, nurses, clergy, people like Luther. Sometimes the authoritative knowledge of religion flows through mediated or material channels of authority, scriptures, rituals, sacred substances, material culture, relics, that sort of thing. But I think no matter what, authoritative knowledge depends on relationships of trust, of credibility, and also of coercion as well. So it's no matter what, it's always social knowledge, whether it's based on scientific claims or spiritual claims in the context of public health concerns. So for that reason, one community's authoritative knowledge about medicine and healing may appear to those outside of that social circle to be quackery or charlatanism or trickery or something else that needs debunking and not adherence. And then there's a third level of the body politic. So where there's authority, there's always power. And at the level of the body politic, We have to think about religion as a way that people organize themselves into collectives and get organized by others. And here I'm sort of drawing from some of the recent work of Katie Lofton and others. So the vulnerability of the human body, especially at points of birth and death, means that societies have a perpetual need to organize healing and healthcare. And these forms of organization are often shaped by intersectional networks that advantage some and oppress others, as we know, whether it's racism, sexism, class privilege, religious discrimination. And as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown yet again, communicable diseases are not true equalizers, but instead they hit the poor, the marginalized, the racialized harder than others. And the fact that medical care, whether it's biomedical or complementary, costs money means that access to it depends on how it is politically organized, as demonstrated by ongoing battles about publicly funded healthcare, whether it's pharmacare here in Canada or other forms of public health here in the States. And the questions of discussions of how and who can access the COVID-19 vaccine. As Luther's example shows, it's important to remember that religious organizations have played leading roles both historically and today in expanding access to healthcare around the world, at the same time that there might be ways that religious organizations have very sharp and differentially critical perspectives on public health. So as noted, COVID-19 has brought into sharp relief the structural injustice of surviving in North America, whether it's in a pandemic time or not. Black Americans are being killed by the virus at a much higher rate than others due to long-term systemic lack of access to healthcare and to adequate housing. And as we know, Indigenous people are also at great risk when the virus finds its way into their communities due to the lack of infrastructure essential for public health. Especially clean water. So the boil water advisories that are still plaguing, I guess you could say, many Indigenous nations due to lack of federal action are one clear example of that. Those boil water advisories, that lack of clean water, that's a result of drinking water or water for washing your hands for that matter. This is a result of broken treaty promises and the result of decades of colonial governments and resource extraction that's actually diverted and stolen water from Indigenous lands. So that's the body politic. Then at the fourth level, I also think it's important to keep thinking about religion as a platform for imagination and creative response and to human need, for visualizing the world and the future otherwise. So to use a public health analogy, you could think of religion as a form of modeling the future, which also has a kind of Geertzian approach to, I guess, too, whether you're thinking about apocalyptic visions or a vision focused on the dignity of every creature. And this is where my second image comes in, which offers a Christian reading of the pandemic that is quite counter to Luther's. It's an anti-public health march held in Texas on April 18th, 2020. There are a lot of different images like this. I was, of course, not here for this march, but I thought this one was particularly vivid. There's probably lots we could unpack here. This image shows a very different commitment to public life, but a commitment to public life nonetheless. And like Luther, it's one that rests on biblical readings. So apocalypticism, or reading plagues through the stories of the book of Revelation. That is nothing new. It's shown by many paintings of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that you probably also saw on Twitter and Instagram, especially early on in the pandemic. One of them is the Pale Rider, often understood as plague itself. But this image stood out to me in part because of its irony. So you have maskless people who largely seem to be white people gathering in close proximity to each other as a collective in counter protest to the collectivity of public health. They're also rooted in a kind of Texas exceptionalism overlaid with vaccine denial. And this image has, as I said, has got lots going on in it. I'd be happy to hear your perspectives later. It also has a citation to Isaiah 26:2, which says, "Open ye the gates, that the righteous nation which keepeth the truth may enter in." So a kind of Texas as nation. It also has an anti-government message where you've got a really interesting mix of Bill Gates and George Soros and Mike Pompeo and Fauci and Deborah Birx. And so you get Trump, co-workers, and you've also got a lot of a mixed bag of people there who might not always be in the same bucket. But then you probably can't see it, but at the back there's a sign that says, "We are innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until proven innocent." And I can't see the bottom of it, so I'm not totally sure what they're saying there. But it reminded me of a really interesting book by a woman named Patricia Limerick, a historian, called The Legacy of Conquest. And I see this image as a kind of a marker of the settler nation of manifest destiny combined with God's providence sort of being invoked. So Patricia Limerick documents how 19th century white settlers in what became the Western United States, the frontier, were oriented by strong convictions of self-reliance and individual liberty, including the right to preempt land. And when things did not go their way, whether because they didn't find gold or their crops turned to dust, they often adopted a discourse of what she calls injured innocence. Many would, in her words, slide smoothly from blaming the Indians to blaming the federal government for their misfortunes. And so Limerick's analysis helps us see how the discourse of injured innocence continues to be replicated in settler colonial discourse in a way that erases the historical and ongoing reality of Indigenous presence and sovereignty, even in the midst of a pandemic, and undergirds it with biblical Christian providential narratives. So declaring Texas to be a righteous nation at the mercy of a cabal of federal politicians and philanthropists is really an insistence on settler preeminence. So now I want to turn to the work of another medical historian called Charles Rosenberg, who thinks about pandemics and epidemics with sort of dramaturgical metaphors. So for Rosenberg, an epidemic, he's writing about AIDS largely, has a dramaturgical structure shaped by the intensity of its speed, how fast it spreads, and its scale, how widely it spreads. An epidemic, in his words, takes on a quality of a pageant, mobilizing communities to act out propitiatory rituals that incorporate and reaffirm fundamental social values and modes of understanding. But as this Texas March shows, these performed social values are not always shared. So AIDS, like COVID-19, revealed how the propitiatory rituals of a pandemic may be just as focused on disrupting and challenging social values, as in the case of the ACT UP group, which is a fascinating case to think about, or in the case of unmasking or refusing to mask. So there's questions of publics and counter-publics at play here. There's also stories of ritual improvisation, I think, that come out in pandemics in interesting ways. And here you could think about, again, early on in the pandemic, the Pope assured the faithful that Catholic doctrine allows for people to bypass a priest and confess their sins directly to God while staying home during the pandemic. I don't know what Luther would have thought about that. Orthodox rabbis in Israel agreed that in 2020, it was more important to connect generations of families at online Seder meals than to forbid the use of electronics on Passover. The Sikh community in Calgary early on in the pandemic brought vegetarian meals every day to truckers at gas stations and truck stops so that they could continue to eat and do their essential work, what time when restaurants were shuttered all along the highway. And then in one of my favorite examples, Ojibwe women in Minnesota and Manitoba started virtual jingle dress dances online at a time when in-person powwows were not possible. And this was especially powerful because the jingle dress itself is a dance that came out of the Spanish flu, the 1918 influenza epidemic among Ojibwe women, which has its own really interesting story. So I think maybe we leave it here. In addition to the timing and scale of contagion, a disease becomes an epidemic through public performances. And Rosenberg uses this metaphor of dramaturgy to divide the collective action in the face of an epidemic into these three acts of progressive revelation. You sort of start figuring it out, managing randomness. How do you know? Masks, no masks, what do you do? Negotiating public response. How are we going to act collectively in the face of this threat? And so people watch each other, they ask each other for advice, they think of themselves collectively and in relation to each other with both solidarity and with fear. And so here I think the amplification of media is key for the success and spread of stories of contagion. And the frequent use of images such as the Texas Mark of the Beast March, that was for a news story that was actually about how most Texans supported public health measures. Um, it shows you that a lot of the sort of religious angle on the coverage of the pandemic is one that focuses on COVID-19 denialism and not so much on those ritual improvisational stories I was telling before. So this denialism, COVID denialism, rooted in a commitment to individual or religious liberty, has been reported on across the world. The conservative Christian pastors who refuse to stop church gatherings, whether in Seoul or Ohio or Ontario, Hasidic men who have burned masks in the streets of New York, anti-maskers who've decided that there is no pandemic. This is what I heard at a small, very small downtown Toronto rally that I passed by at one point. These people feel compelled to gather in public, whether in their churches, which are kind of quasi-public, or in the streets in opposition to public health measures as a threat to their individual and religious liberties. So people have taken to the streets to perform the body politic during COVID-19 with the heightened stakes of knowing that there are heightened stakes of what it means to gather in public and with a lot of religious rhetoric at hand. But of course, there are other stories of gathering during the pandemic, and images of the Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and many other Black people by police have conspicuously more masks in them, somewhat more physical distancing, and a lot greater police presence. So this points to the next sort of phase, that public health responses to COVID-19 are necessarily political. They're structured by federal and state jurisdictions and constrained by borders. We kind of get a new sense of the significance of the nation state in a pandemic. In an age of globalization, responses to COVID-19 have shown how healthcare is inexorably collective, but also jurisdictional, and that access to it is unequal and unjust. Unsurprisingly, at least for scholars of religion, I would say, the pandemic has shown how important religion, especially at the level of authoritative knowledge, the body politic as a platform for imagination, is how important religion is for ways that people respond to public health measures like masking and physical distancing. So public rituals show social values, yes, but they also show conflicts over priorities about what it is to be social and collective and public. And they provide insight into structures of authority and belief. You could also say that public health measures themselves also become kind of rituals that integrate sort of cognitive, emotional elements, visibly acting out community solidarity by wearing masks or by rejecting them, for example. So now I want to turn to the next image. So the element of luck and risk in COVID-19, why does it pass some people by, leave others with a mild flu, permanently disable or kill others, is not simply explained by way of misfortune or spiritual defense or scapegoating. It's at once intimate, biological, infrastructural, political, who lives and who dies. And the brilliant work of Plains Cree artist Ruth Cuthand from Treaty 6 territory in what many now call Saskatchewan, vividly shows how viruses were central to the colonial project. And Ruth Cuthand's Trading and Surviving series, which were made long before COVID, is made up of groupings of beaded viruses. And I use these images with her permission. In Ruth Cuthand's words, beads and viruses go hand in hand, new diseases and goods that traders brought to Americas. So the Trading and Surviving series are 12 images of viruses brought by the Europeans and one new disease that was brought back to Europe, syphilis. And so the European diseases are done in beads, which is very much a tradition, artistic tradition of Indigenous women largely, but the beads themselves came from European sources. The syphilis image she made was made out of quill work, so an indigenously sourced material medium. Once COVID-19 arrived, Cuthand added to her collection, acknowledging and even aestheticizing the virus. In an interview, she reflected, so for me to bead COVID-19, whenever you bead anything, it looks gorgeous because of the depth of the color and the shine of the beads and everything. And then you realize it's a disease. So then you're repelled by that. And I think that's what's kind of going on a daily basis. It's difficult to try and navigate this whole thing. So whether framed or she did some on a mask as well, Cuthand's work materializes the history and ongoing reality of a multi-jurisdictional body politic that is both porous and traded and violent and surviving. And I would say in one way, Cuthand's work is an artistic reinterpretation of an argument made by an environmental historian, Alfred Crosby, in his book, Ecological Imperialism from 1986. So Crosby sort of takes a follow the pathogen approach to explain the success, I guess, of European colonizers. He proposes looking at colonialism and imperialism through the lens of all kinds of microbes, flora, fauna, and how they traveled. And he insists on thinking about the specificity of symptoms, especially of smallpox, which was so devastating for Indigenous people. So it was highly transmissible. The death rates of people who got it were shockingly high. There was a lack of immunity among the Indigenous people when confronted with it from the European people who brought it. It also was devastating in terms of killing children at a high rate. So there's a lot to learn from Crosby's perspective, I think, but it also risks becoming kind of a pathogen determinism if it neglects what Rosenberg might call the dramaturgical structure of colonial epidemics. And more importantly, which have to include thinking about the politics of treaty relations, treaty breaking, and the ways that settlers were moving, not just with their pathogens, but also through turning land into property and other kinds of things. Cuthand's work, with its focus on trading and surviving, acknowledges the pathogen and actually brings it right forward, but situates it in a new medium that in a way makes it at once beautiful and also holds not just the virus, but settler memory politically accountable. And here, if you can turn to the next quote, next slide. So she says, though humor softens the blow of a critical message, I have found that making work which confronts the most difficult truths about Canadian society and the impacts of colonization on Aboriginal people are made remarkably palatable when delivered in a strikingly seductive package. So there's a lot going on in that quote, which I'm not going to unpack here, but I would be happy to hear if anyone has comments on that. If you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend reading Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt's Yellowhead Institute report on COVID-19, the numbered treaties and the politics of life, which was written, I think, in June of 2020. And they argue that in connection with the Canadian political system, Indigenous nations are particularly at risk in a pandemic because of lack of adequate infrastructure and healthcare. Indigenous nations and poor racialized communities, as I said before, are most likely to have toxic water or no running water at all with which to wash their hands of the virus, quite literally. As Starblanket and Hunt show, the pandemic reveals anew the importance of rooting both a vision and an infrastructure of public life in treaty partnerships and as living agreements that actually made possible the settler state. And they write, if we follow a conception of wellness and quality of life broadly defined, then advancing the question of health in a treaty context requires both comprehensive actions to meet the immediate needs of Indigenous communities, but also longer term forms of change in the political relationships between treaty partners. So in a way, they're saying the virus is a call for change, one of many, of course. As we've seen with COVID-19, suspicion of government responses comes from many quarters, government public health measures. The credibility of public health is tested when systematic injustice means that some communities, such as Indigenous nations, do not have the medical care or running water they need to follow public health care recommendations. And here, the work of public health researcher and medical doctor, Dr. Lisa Richardson, her approach to what she calls decolonizing Indigenous public health rests on very different bases of authoritative knowledge. Her work honors the perspectives of elders and hears their suspicion of government public health initiatives. It listens to them. At the same time, she's got this new initiative with others called Sharing Medicine, if you can go to the next slide, Emma, which seeks to bring together biomedical knowledge with knowledge that comes from Indigenous law, kinship relations, spirituality. And I recommend you go to this site. There's a lot of really interesting things there, including a fascinating video of a family of Mohawk women in which the daughters are trying to talk to their mother about her vaccine hesitancy. And one of the daughters is a doctor. It's a really It's a very, very powerful exchange. So the sharing medicine approach is a very different position from which to critique public health when compared to the apocalyptic Christian platforms for imagination that I was pointing to earlier. So I'm just going to conclude now by saying that COVID-19 really does bring into stark relief so many paradoxes of our current existence, about how fragile and necessary public trust and public infrastructure are for democratic, multi-religious, multi-jurisdictional societies, and that public trust, I think there's something about the history and present of treaties and Indigenous scholars who think about treaties like John Burroughs and others that can actually help us reimagine what public trust might look like. Like many others, I am worried that the pandemic paradoxes that we face will not act necessarily as a wake-up call for better public health care and infrastructure oriented towards justice and treaty partnerships, but perhaps might end up exacerbating the inequities of our world, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A as well. But I would say that work like that of Ruth Cuthand and other artists especially is a really powerful call, wake-up call to remember and to enact anew the promises that enabled North Americans to become a body politic on Indigenous land. So the coronavirus it's a traveler. In some ways, it's a teacher. I do not want to lessen the trauma and the mourning that will also come in its wake, but it has allowed us to ask different kinds of questions differently. And I would say that scholars of religion and public life will need to be thinking and writing about and talking about the effects of the virus and its stories for years to come. So thank you very much for this invitation. I look forward to our conversation. Can't hear you, Shauna.
I just showed it. Yes, my computer just informed me of that. You get that little message, you are muted. I was saying thank you so much. And I was telling you how wonderfully smart and stimulating that was. I have to say that the idea of the pandemic exacerbating inequities further is fairly depressing as far as end notes, but I do really appreciate the more hopeful Indigenous perspectives that you've brought to these topics as well. I want to thank Johannes for that great introduction. I want to add my thanks to Emma Fraser for all of her help and hard work on the organization of this series. I want to add thanks to Ainsley Coghill as well for her great posters, advertising, and work on the video recordings from this series. And now I want to open things up for questions now for Dr. Klassen. I think there were already a couple in the chat, and I'll start with those. But please, audience members, as questions occur to you, please just type them into the chat and I will pose them to Dr. Klassen on your behalf. So, new window, here we go. The first question is regarding contagion narratives for non-medical communication, for example, Facebook. Do you have any comment on how these can be not just of religion, but also about religion? Will we see an epidemic of contagion narratives in humanities? That's the question.
That is a very interesting question, and I'm not sure how I would answer it. So not just of religion, but also about religion. So I mean, maybe I sort of answered it at the end of the lecture that, yeah, I think we need to keep talking about contagion narratives, but I'm not sure I fully understand. There maybe is a lot of wordplay in that question, and I'm not quite sure which direction I'm supposed to toss the ball. Well,
I will reveal that it was Johannes's question.
Oh, okay.
And so if he wants to
ask me your question.
I'm sorry about so I guess when you started with contagion narratives, I guess the first, I was thinking not about framing contagion narratives in terms of religion, but the possibility that contagion narratives would actually frame religion. And as we become much more comfortable with contagion narratives, they would add an extra humanistic tool to our religious studies toolbox. Of course, because you also started with Luther, I was immediately ripped back into the early modern period where, of course, religious change was understood in analogy to contagion very often. People, I mean, it's a, you know, standard trope that heresy plague in the wake of the Reformation. So I guess that was the question, whether becoming more reflexively aware of the cultural roots of contagion narrative will make us smarter about religion.
We can we can only hope. I mean, I think as you likely noticed, in trying to talk about religion in these sort of 4 levels, I tried to avoid defining religion. One could also say that religion is not a very helpful term, especially in the context of thinking about in the Indigenous responses that I was talking about, where, you know, the word religion is really not used at all. In fact, the word that in the context of the Sharing Medicines Project, the word that's used is spirituality, which I think, you know, requires sort of thinking through the genealogy of that term as well. But I think there is something about, I think that's why it's been so exciting teaching this course, because it's got me thinking with medical anthropology, as well as trying to bring in some of the religious studies scholarship as well into connection with medical anthropology, which I think is often very rich. My levels of thinking about religion there is also kind of riffing off of Margaret Locke and Nancy Shepherd Hughes' work on what they call the mindful body, but kind of going in some different directions. So I think there's what I like about thinking with both that sort of those levels of religion, but also thinking with the idea of the dramaturgical from Rosenberg, is it gets us out of having to spend too much time about critiquing the word religion, deciding whether we need to, you know, throw it out or define it exactly, and allows for just a little more kind of, I don't know, prisms of analysis, as opposed to sort of I guess if I'm going to use a vaccine metaphor, like I like prismatic analysis more than penetrating analysis. Let's just put it that way. Oh, do you want me to say something about Luther? I do not feel like I can answer a question about Luther to Johannes, but I will try. I do think that there's something really very interesting about, I mean, I think one could write a great article on the use of the secular in this letter in and of itself, and thinking about, which I'm not going to write, but maybe you could, Johannes, and thinking about how, I mean, I think this is one of the things about a pandemic or an epidemic. It makes you realize that health is definitely cannot be just understood as on an individual basis. It makes it really clear that health is a public or collective obligation, health and sickness, in ways that we ignore at our peril, like quite literally. So I think there's really something very interesting about the ways different, if you could look at sort of different pandemics to see how they bring about new commitments to thinking collectively about health, or don't, depend as the case may be. I think there's also a lot of pandemic amnesia. I mean, they call the Spanish flu the forgotten epidemic, right? Because people sort of, like, although clearly it's not forgotten anymore because now everyone's talking about it. So,
thanks. I actually had a very different question. I was thinking about when you said, when you were talking about the narratives that the media is putting out around, particularly, you know, the churches that aren't complying with public health measures, or the, you know, like the Texas group that you showed, and sort of where religion is anti-establishment. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, and you know, why are those narratives sort of, why are those the narratives that we're hearing about religion from the media?
right. I mean, to be fair, maybe I was being a little not fair to the media, because especially around at the beginning of the coronavirus, of the pandemic, perhaps because of its sort of intersection with Easter and important moments in the liturgical calendar. There were a lot of court cases that around focused on religious liberty arguments in the United States. So it wasn't like these were just people gathering in public marches here and there. They were also using many different tools to be anti-establishment, although I guess a court case isn't necessarily anti-establishment. It's actually using jurisdictional powers to make space for your religious perception. But I do think that there is a kind of media amplification thing going on. And I think that, QAnon and all of these sort of nest of contagion stories that go in all kinds of different directions have clearly been enabled by a whole other level of mediation and media amplification through social media. But you all know that. You don't need me to tell you about that. It's also pretty good. I don't really watch TV, but whatever it is, those images are arresting. And I also, now I'm giving everybody ideas for what I think they should write papers about, but I do think it would be really worthwhile to compare images of, and I'm sure someone has done this already, images of the Black Lives Matter protest and images of these white, clearly January 6th got everyone thinking about that as well, that people who are white have a lot more freedom to be anti-establishment than people who are Black or not white. And then I guess it would be interesting to think about how where one would see or notice religion in those two different depictions, which is a question I can't answer.
Yeah, no, that's actually a whole other dimension to the question that I hadn't thought of. Interesting. Well, there are at this time no further questions in the chat. So I don't know if the audience is just so transfixed. I see someone has their hand up, but unfortunately you have to put the question in the chat. Okay, someone's putting a question in the chat.
Someone has asked me here if hope is a scholarly or a theological virtue.
Yes. Sorry, that was part of Johannes's paragraph. I didn't realize it was a separate question.
Yeah. I would say it's probably not an either or, and I would have to know what's the difference between scholarly and theological, which I do think there is a difference, but I guess I hope that hope is a human virtue. That's what I would say.
Fair enough. It was a simultaneous allusion to Paul and Bruce Lincoln. So
right.
When you say you had another question, Johannes, was that the same question or?
No, actually, I have. I mean, I don't want to monopolize things, and I think we have somebody who says they're working on a question. But in the meantime, I was intrigued by the idea that the difference between the epidemic phase and the endemic phase of a disease is largely one of timing and timing perception, and in a sense, any disease in an endemic phase that suddenly gets a lot of publicity may be considered epidemic. And I was wondering whether you see any danger, and it's fairly compelling, and that's definitely one of the ways in which medievalists have distinguished between the epidemic and the endemic phase of Black Death, for example. Like the Black Death was perceived, seen, and then also experienced because of that perception as a frightful epidemic. But then it went into 300, 400, 500 years of endemic phase, and only periodically and locally would again become deemed epidemic. My question is, if we put so much on the perception and the media-driven perception, are we getting close? Are we running any risk of sort of falling into that error that Jean Baudrillard sort of fell into when he declared infamously the first Gulf War to be nothing but a media event.
Right.
And are we somehow minimizing, denying,
No, I think I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think people will be probably more careful with their use of the word epidemic in the next maybe 5 years. I don't know how long. So, we'd say like there's an epidemic of gun violence, there's an epidemic of this, there's an epidemic of that, right? And I think there is a sort of precision to the term that makes it a useful term, and clearly we understand it differently having lived through one. I think Rosenberg's approach to thinking about the epidemic as a question of timing is actually really, really helpful, because it is, it's the epidemic. I mean, if you can cast your mind back to, little more than a year ago, people weren't necessarily worried about COVID-19 if they were not, in Wuhan or somewhere closer to the epicenter of it. They weren't worried about it until they felt that it was a risk to them. And I think that's where his point about speed and scale really does make a lot of sense to people who have lived through a pandemic, that it is once it is swiftly moving and increasingly deadly, that people start paying attention in a different way. So, but then again, I think there's also a power, a question of power and erasure around what gets counted as an epidemic and what gets counted as endemic. So diabetes would be another excellent example of something that is considered endemic, but if you look at indigenous populations, you could say that it is an epidemic. So I think there's a whole question around what scale one determines these things. So
thank you.
Thanks. Question in the chat. How does religion interact with public amnesia about pandemics? Noting that epidemiologists and virologists never forgot the 1918 flu and have regularly been warning of the next pandemic, but there was a quick pushback against the quick response to SARS in Toronto and almost instant amnesia in the public health sector.
Interesting. So saying that that epidemiologists themselves forgot SARS, but remember the 1918 flu, or
I'm not sure I read it that way. Rather that they never forgot the 1918 flu, that they've been warning about it, but there was, I guess, public pushback, against the response, the quick response to SARS in Toronto, and then and the public health sector also wasn't
okay. Yeah. Oh, I see. So public health learned lessons in SARS and then probably forgot them. Or maybe the public health people remembered them, but then the government officials who needed to give the money to public health forgot what they, the reason why they had set up all these various kinds of protocols. It's a great question, how religion intersects with the public amnesia about pandemics. And I wonder, I'm not sure I have the answer to that question. It's really an interesting one. Perhaps if one feels that you've kind of conquered something, or moved past it, or have been saved or redeemed, then you forget the trauma. But there are many examples of religious groups that how do I say this? Definitely do not forget their trauma, and it becomes part of their story. So, the 1918 flu is perhaps also, because it was so closely so close on the, well, actually on the heels of the war, I would say that the trauma that gets remembered from that period is World War I more than the flu. So, but that is not answering your question about how religion interacts there.
I wonder, I mean, one of the things you said early in the talk struck me, and that was the idea that having been washed in the blood of Jesus, you know, the woman that you were talking about had nothing to worry about. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think of the public health sector as thinking of themselves quite in that way, but I just wonder about the parallel kind of tracks of amnesia, maybe, or of lack of concern.
And maybe with SARS, I mean, maybe people think that was a successful. Like we dealt with it. It was, you know, minimal compared to what we're dealing with now. And instead of learning the lessons of SARS, thinking that we somehow had dealt with it, so we don't need to keep learning those lessons. But yeah, I mean, I'm writing something else now where I'm talking about my own pandemic amnesia, and how in the book that I wrote on religion and medicine, which is a kind of goes through the 20th century and has a whole chapter on these sort of early 20th century liberal Protestants and their sort of alliance with biomedicine in being sharply critical of Christian Science and Pentecostal healing, faith healing in the 1920s. I looked at a lot of archives. I read a lot of stuff. I don't even think about the 1918 flu in that chapter, despite the fact that many people would have had their own memories of people who died in it or their own experience of it. But for me, I just clearly, now that I've lived through a pandemic, I'm going to be pandemic aware in a way that someone else who doesn't have that, which basically is a lesson again about positionality and lived experience and what we see and don't see based on our own experiences, which I don't think are the limit of what we can do as scholars. I don't think our own experiences are the limit of our scholarly abilities, but it's always humbling to be aware of the limits of your own knowledge.
I like that, and might be a good note to end on. I don't see any other questions in the chat, although I don't mind giving people a minute if they want to gather their thoughts. Yeah, I feel like I have lots of questions, but they're not quite formed, and I'm still kind of sifting through the various layers of things that you talked about. Yes, someone wrote too many questions to type and listen at the same time.
I do have a question for you, Hannes. Do you know anything more about those images? Like, can you give us a little, can you tell us about
the Kanak images?
Yeah.
I don't, not in the way that an art historian would. I mean, Kanak was basically was Luther or Kanak's workshop, and it was a big workshop. So we don't actually know how much of that kind of work was Kanak and how much was his big workshop. Became kind of Luther's visual propaganda arm, and he did a whole bunch of, some of the more famous scurrilous woodcuts as well as the famous portraits. I know a little bit more about the long-term sort of epidemic distribution and then endemic presence of those images, because they become the basis for, that's the way that the reformer is memorialized, despite all the talk about the Reformation producing sort of cadres of literate reading Protestants. Of course, the way most people who came to develop Lutheran identities thought of Luther was in terms of those Kanak images. And so they're reproduced lots and lots and lots of times. The first thing and then of course ultimately became cult objects in their own right, including miracle working, apotropaic objects. So they're, Bob Scribner, who was my doctoral supervisor many years ago, sort of upset a lot of pious Lutherans when he published an article on the incombustible Luther images that circulated, these sort of miracle relics that were basically based on that Kanak portrait. I'm not giving you a good answer on how they were produced. It is amazing and probably not coincidental that the Reformation took hold in what's sometimes called the wild growth phase, in the 1520s. The first 10 years are from 1518 to 1528. That first decade was also a decade of recurrent violent plagues, and that created a whole lot of instability and chaos. So, for example, the community that I study, between 1523 and 1525, they went through 3 leaders because they kept dying of plague. And so, I mean, and that's before the Peasants' War turns everything sideways again. So the context of the epidemic for the taking hold of the Reformation, the fact that if the Reformation changed everything, it's not, I mean, that's an open question, but if it was this tremendous rupture, it's a rupture that sort of is really parasitic on the disruption of that great plague wave. And it hit, I mean, if you think not being able to go to your office is terrible, the entire University of Freiburg was forced, they got all the faculty and all the students to march, halfway across southern Germany and sit on an island or in Lake Constance to wait for the plague to go away, and then march another, 400 kilometers back. So it's extremely, I'm not answering your question, I'm talking about something completely different.
No, you are answering the question. I mean, because I think that's the thing that, like, I started looking at those. I mean, I'd looked at those images many times in different ways, but then once I put them together with the timing of his plague letter, we'll call it, you realize, oh, like, you can think differently about these images once you can situate them in a particular time and place and experience that you're just,
I believe there's some scholarship, and it may be sort of partly evil and sort of confessional and nasty, points out that Kanak only really ever painted one female, and they all look the same. And the other famous one, in addition to Katharina von Bora, of course, is his Eve in the Garden of Eden, who has and then there's also there's a couple more, but they're all the same figure, and people sort of said, what's going on here?
I think I read some of that too. We have one of those Kranachs at U of T, actually, in one of our galleries.
But I'm sorry, I can't tell you more about that. But we, if you're going to talk about pandemics and the body, you're going to eventually end up at sex too.
True.
Yeah. Have you gotten to that part of your course yet?
I don't know that we're getting to that part, although that was one of the things I remember walking through the park in the springtime and worrying how people were going to fall in love. That was my big worry.
When I was in my last year of undergraduate, I don't know if anyone is still listening. Can I?
Oh yeah, there's still an audience. You got to censor yourself.
No, I'll be very careful. But John Hatcher at the time was offering a special subject seminar on the Black Death and its aftermath. So that's the first time I had studied pandemics. And I signed up for the seminar. So this was probably 1986. I signed up for the seminar. I went, and it was 12 young men had all signed up for the seminar. And it was, of course, exactly in the first broad awareness of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in England in the mid 80s. And it was very striking the way in which interest in epidemic disease had sort of manifested itself in the male student body almost exclusively. So it's just an aside. But
there have been a couple of comments in the chat as well. I don't know if you saw them, Pamela. Noel Salmond said quite a bit ago that his understanding is that there was a deliberate effort to suppress reporting on the 1918 epidemic, and that's when we were talking about that.
That's interesting, because one of the essays we used in the class was by a scholar named Vanessa Gamble, who writes about the idea that it was thought that Black people were less often that they didn't get the flu at the same rate as white people, and so she investigates this. She's a medical historian, a Black scholar herself, and she investigates this and finds that part of the problem is very hard to get any data on Black people in 1918 and whether they were able to access healthcare, those kinds of things. But what she does do is goes to the Black press to look at newspaper articles about in the Black press about the Spanish flu or the 1918 flu, and finds that perhaps there's some evidence in these newspaper articles that it's not affecting people as terribly, as it's not as lethal, but it's clearly still affecting people. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And that, I mean, obviously there were all kinds of, in the beginning of the current pandemic, there were all kinds of suppressions of reporting and, you know, numbers that were wrong and called into question. And then how do you count and how do you know how many people were actually dead from COVID or from really, you know, so I think
that is one thing that seems to be changing in the Canadian context, is that we are now officially tracking race-based data, which I think Canadian universities and Canadian government bodies were not doing, and I think it's been demanded by Black and Indigenous communities that the government is keeping track in the context of COVID. So that will be interesting to see what the effect of that is.
And then we had another comment of someone who saw a picture of two people kissing while wearing masks.
Nice.
And a comment that in a Muslim country like Indonesia, COVID makes people, I guess, more devoted to God.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are going to be the questions that the scholars of religion of the future are going to have lots of room to ask. What happens to religion in the face of a pandemic in which people are face to face with death in a really very different way? I think it also, especially in the context of Canada, I would hope that it makes us ask hard questions about how we value the elderly and how we understand the role of elderly people in a wider span of what are our understanding of what it means to care for elderly people when they need care.
Yeah,
which I think is also a kind of could factor into kind of rites of passage style research and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean on the question of religion and turning towards religion in, you know, times of crisis, and I wonder what scholars of the future, as you said, you know, looking back on the data that it can be gathered from this period, what other roles religion plays or what long-term effects there are on religious devotion, religious rituals, religious ideas kind of going forward as well.
Yeah, someone is asking that question about the effect of religious rituals on funerals. And I think weddings and funerals are, I mean, classically those rites of passage where people end up turning to religious organizations when they aren't usually doing so in their lives. And so it'll be interesting to see if people say, okay, yeah, maybe we don't actually need to go to a church to get married, or maybe they want to even more. Who knows? I don't know. I know I'm not a prophet, but
that's too bad. Another question from a third-year student from Lake Helen Reserve. Do you think Indigenous communities would be more receptive to a vaccine if treaties were respected, or do you think the general distrust of the government would persist?
That's a good, hard question. I think that if you think about just to recall the video that I recommended you watch on that Sharing Medicine site, one of the most powerful parts of the video is where the daughter, who is a doctor, and I forget her name now, says to the mother, "You told me to go and get this medical education, and now I'm bringing back my medical knowledge, and I'm bringing it into Haudenosaunee understandings of law and governance, and I'm trying to wrap it in with those things that you taught me. She's speaking to her mother. And so the daughter feels strongly that you can bring medical knowledge into an Indigenous perspective in a way that, as it says here, unpacking biomedicine and then I guess repacking it as well. And so I think I think for, I mean, I don't necessarily know that I'm the right person to answer this question, but from watching that exchange, it was clear that for the mother, she wanted to be heard. She wanted her concerns around the vaccine to be heard, especially in the context of, you know, many, and not just her own, but many Indigenous people's negative experiences with the medical system and the government more broadly. And to overcome or to rethink her vaccine hesitancy, talking to her daughters about the question. Even the daughter, you could tell the daughters really want her to kind of rethink things because they love their mother. But that seemed to be the most powerful turning point in the conversation, was the daughter's ability to say, medicine is just, it's scientific. You have to believe it. It was more this unpacking of medicine and retethering it to other forms of authoritative knowledge. I think if treaties were respected, let's see what happens if treaties get respected. That would be a future that I would like to see. I don't know whether the general distrust of the government will persist or not, but respecting treaties would be a start.
And then we have another comment. Curiously, we had to decrease public gatherings for religion during COVID rather than increasing public mass ritual as was done during plague in medieval Spain, for example. Which
interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to invite all of you to come to an event that we're having later in March, because it's online and you could all come, and it's called Digital Effervescence, and it's my colleague Bart Scott and Julie Big are curating a conversation with GTA religious leaders of various sorts about what it was like to go online during COVID, and they're working off sort of a Durkheimian collective effervescence idea, and can there be a thing called digital effervescence? Because I think in some cases, and I have no numbers here, but in some cases, it sounds like people started going to religious, weekly religious, whether it's church or synagogue or whatever, because it was online. Whether they stuck with it or not is another question. So, but that's one of the things we'll be talking about in that session. Digital.
Send me the information and I'll send it out to her. It's really interesting because I feel anecdotally that people I know, because they're stuck at home, are going to religious services online because they're free and available, and there's people they know there that they can sort of feel community with. So that's a really interesting idea.
And you don't have to drive around looking for parking.
There's that.
Yeah, and you can stay in your pajamas and
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we've probably kept you long enough, Pamela. So I just want to thank you one more time. This has really been fantastic. And I'd like to thank the audience, especially those of you who stuck it out the whole time, for your thoughtful questions, for your thoughtful comments, for supporting our Religion and Public Life series. And we'll hope to see you again for our final lecture in this series, which is scheduled for April 1st. We will be welcoming Dr. Gay Byron from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and she will speak with us about race and ethnicity in the Bible and in public life. Looking forward to that very much. And thanks again, Pamela. It was wonderful.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure and an honor. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.